Hello, once again, ladies and gentlemen. And what I want to do right now is go over the actual assignment 20-3, which is having to deal with more percents, more fractions, and more decimals. And what is interesting about this lesson is that we're really just expanding on what we saw yesterday and even in the previous video. As we go into the lesson, I do encourage you to have your Schoology open as we're going to be going over the exact problems that are due for today. And so with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. We begin with 1C, which is asking us to change 51.2% into a fraction. So we have 51.2%. Now, by now, you should know that anytime I have a percent, like something like 8%, all you have to do to change that into a fraction is put whatever's in front of the percent symbol on top of 100. So 8% is going to be 8 over 100. Now, while that might seem obvious to some of you, you will note that there is something odd about this percentage up here, though. There is a decimal value. And that might throw some of you guys off. But remember that even in 8%, there is a decimal right there. In fact, there's always a decimal. You can always put a decimal at the end of anything that is a ones place. So 8% is the same thing as 8.0%. There is a decimal. Well, there is no decimal value. There is a decimal right there. And nevertheless, the answer would still be 8%. Or 8 over 100. In fact, the decimal is still there, but even though there's no decimal value in front of, in the numerator or denominator. But yes, you can still put a decimal right there to express that there's nothing after the 8 of value, there's nothing after the 100 of value. So if that is true, then 51.2% should be the same thing as 51.2 over 100. Again, 51.2% literally means 51.2 out of 100. Now, we're not done, though. That's only the beginning. But yes, these two things are equivalent. They're the exact same thing. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. We're not used to having decimals in the numerator, or rather in a fraction at all. And so that's because that's kind of odd. We don't want to have that there. So let's do something about it. In fact, let's just take that decimal and let's move it over so that instead of 51.2, now it says 512. 512. There's no more, or rather the decimal is now at the very end. Now there's no more decimal value. Ladies and gentlemen, that is allowed. I can do that if I not only do that same thing to the numerator, but also to the denominator. To which some of you will say, well, how? There's no decimal, but there is. There's a decimal here next to the ones place on the 100. So if I move the decimal over one time on the numerator, I'm going to move the decimal over one time on the denominator and just add a 0. So 51.2 out of 100 is the exact same thing as 512 over 1,000. Let me recap what I just did before I explain it. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, we started with 51.2%, and we saw that 51.2% is the same thing as 51.2 per 100 or over 100. And yes, there is a decimal right here at the end of 100. Now, that's fine and dandy, but to begin the simplifying process, I need to grab that decimal and make sure that there's only whole numbers in the numerator. I only moved it once, and because I moved it once in the numerator, I have to move it one time also in the denominator. Had I moved it 2 times in the numerator, I would move it 2 times in the denominator. Had I moved it 3 times in the numerator, I would move it 1, 2, 3 times in the denominator and just add as many zeros as I need. This left me with 512 over 1,000. Now, how is that possible? How is it that 51.2 out of 100 is the same thing as 512 over 1,000? Before I even try to simplify this. Well, think about it this way. Isn't it true that 1/10 is the same thing as 10 over 100? If you think about it, it's almost like I just took the decimal in the numerator, moved it over once, and the decimal in the denominator moved over once. And that makes these two equivalent. Had I done it twice, 1, 2, I would do it 1, 2. So yes, 100 over 1,000 is the same thing as 10 over 100, which is the same thing as 1 over 10. As long as you move the decimal in the numerator and denominator the same number of times in the same direction, whatever your resultant fraction is will be equivalent to what you started with, always. That's what allows me to move the decimal all the way to the right on the numerator and do the same thing with the denominator and add the zeros and still have the same fraction. All right, now we just have to simplify this. And I encourage you to rewind that, watch it again if you're a little confused. But let's go ahead and simplify this. Just for the sake of time, I'm just going to show you that you can divide both of these by 8, leaving us with 64 over 125. And that would be the answer. That is the simplest form of this, believe it or not. That is what you would type in into Schoology, 64/125. Why am I giving you the simplified? Well, firstly, because it's not as difficult as it looks. If you think about it, I just divided 512 and 1,000 by 2, and then whatever answer I got, I divided that by 2, and then I was able to divide that by 2 also because it was just even numbers, and that was enough to give me to the lowest form, or just divide by 8. But because this is not what this lesson is about. We've already gone over simplifying. I don't want you to spend your mental energy focusing on simplifying. Rather, I want you to realize that any number that is a percent is that same number, the exact same thing over 100. And if it's a decimal, you can just shift the decimal over on the numerator and shift the decimal in the denominator the same number of times in the same direction. And that will give you an equivalent fraction. Let's try another one. So 64 and 125 over 125 is the answer to number 1C. Let's go to 2A. In 2A, we are given 50.8%. All right, so let's begin with 2A. We have 50.8%. And we want to change that not only to a fraction, but also to a decimal. So let's go ahead and do that. Well, let's first do exactly what we did above. We know that 50.8 is a percent, so that's going to be 50.8 over 100 because it's percent per 100. Excellent. Now, same as before, it is odd that I do have a decimal right there, so I'm going to get rid of it by just shifting it. So then now it says 508, but the only way I can do that is if I do the same thing on the denominator. So I'm going to take the decimal here on the 100 and shift it over 1 time to the right as well, fill in the 0, and that's going to be 508 over 1,000. Now, before I simplify that, let's change this to a decimal as well. And now, if you remember, to change a percent to a decimal, I simply have to apply my favorite fizzy drink, which is Dr. Pepper. And even though it has a decimal, it's still a percent because we have a percent symbol right here. So it's going to be percent to decimal. So it's going to be to the left 2 times. So now there's a decimal in front of the 5, bringing us to 0.508, or rather 0.508. That's what you would type into Schoology. That is the decimal. That is already the decimal. You don't simplify decimals. That is the decimal equivalent. And so in Schoology, when you go to 2A, make sure that when it says decimal, so you click on that, you would write 0.508. Awesome. Now let's figure out the fraction. We need to simplify it. Well, before I even do that, ladies and gentlemen, look at this, 0.508. How would I actually say that number? Isn't this the same thing as 508 thousandths? Again, 508 thousandths. Wait, 508 over 1,000 or thousandths? Isn't that the exact same thing that I got up here? It is. So that verifies it, that even though I went a different route, I made one into a decimal, the other one into a fraction, they still are the exact same thing. They still are the exact same thing. So that's interesting to note. All right, let's go ahead and do this. We can divide both of these by 2, and then which would give me, regardless, and then divide that by 2 again. So essentially, I'm dividing by 4. And that's going to bring me down to 127 over 250. And yes, that is my final answer. 250 and 127 do not have any more common factors. So again, just divide by 2 and then divide by 2 again, and that leaves me 227 over 250. That would be the answer to over here, to blank 2, which is 127 /250. Good. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like for you to do the next one on your own, which is this right here, 32.4%. Just rewind it, follow the same process, but with 32.4. When you simplify it, just divide by 2 until you can't anymore. That should get you to your final answer. All right, let's go down to number 6, where we're comparing fractions, decimals, and percents. Ladies and gentlemen, you can compare fractions, decimals, and percents, so as long as they're in the same form. For example, here I have 5/7 and 71%. Guys, I can easily compare 71% and 5/7 if I make 71% into a fraction by simply putting it over 100. So this is the same thing as 71 over 100. Now, if you remember, I can compare fractions by simply cross multiplying 7 times 71 and 100 times 5. 100 times 5 is 500. 7 times 71, I can just multiply this really easily. 7 times 1 is 7, 7 times 7 is 49. That's going to give me 497. Notice how 500 is greater than 497, meaning that 5/7 is greater than 71%. Yes, because 71% is the same thing as 71 over 100, and I just proved that 5/7 is greater than 71 out of 100. That's it. I could have also changed both of them to a decimal or changed 5/7 into a percent. It doesn't. Some of these will be easier than others, but technically, as long as they're in the same form, you can compare them. Here's another one. I have a decimal and have a percent. If I use Dr. Pepper on the decimal to percent, we go to the right 2 times, always 2 times. That's 56.25%. So what's more, 56.25 or 56.4? This has a greater tenths value, so 56.4 is greater. All right, I could have done the other way. I could have done Dr. Pepper on the percent to decimal. We go to the left, 1, 2. And again, what's greater? 0.5625 or 0.564. We see that we have a 4 in the hundreds, there's 2 in the hundreds. The rest is the same, so obviously this is still greater. So make sure you're doing that for each of these, ladies and gentlemen, that you're comparing decimals to decimals, percents to percents, fractions to fractions. And if they are not in the same form, you can always change one or both of them so that they are in the same form. Out of all of those, so yes, so you're doing 6A, B, C, and D. You're doing number 7, number 8, number 9, number 10, and number 14. Hopefully I've covered enough. Like for example, in 8, when you're putting them in order, same thing as before, make sure they're in the same form. Either all of them be percents, all of them be decimals, and I think decimals would be the easiest, I don't know, or all of them be fractions, so that you're able to compare these percents, decimals, and fractions, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully that was enough. I want to give you the opportunity to try the rest on your own. If you have any more questions, please come talk to me after school. I would love to help you out. But with that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, I will see you next time.